Tonight's speakers are two of our very own, Denis Kania and Joe Suchecki. Denis is the founding member of the DBC and past president. He's been enjoying international birding since 1994. And in that time, he's made about 40 trips to 27 different countries. When he's not traveling, he teaches bird classes at the Morton Arboretum and recently has been creating birding tutorial videos for the DBC educational channel, which I hope everybody's had a chance to see. Joe Suchecki is also a longtime DBC member and past president. Joe took his first international trip with Denis in 2000 and has since visited 15 countries in his travels and has almost 4,000 birds on his international life list. When Joe's not traveling, you can usually find him at Springbrook Prairie, where he's been a longtime steward and bird monitor. Tonight, Joe and Denis will share their travel expertise and show us how easy it is to plan a successful international trip and perhaps inspire us with dreams of magical bird encounters. Okay, Joe. Denis?
We're supposed to do all that? Oh.
Tonight.
So I'm going to first of all share a screen here. Here we go. Okay, so you guys are probably wondering, why are we talking about international travel? No one's been able to travel anywhere. Well, we're really hoping that the floodgates are going to open up here soon. I have plans to travel to the Yucatan before the year is out. And that seems like that trip is actually going to fly. So with our fingers crossed, we're moving forward. And we would like for people to understand, and that's the reason we're talking about this tonight. We would like you to understand just where all the birds are in the world. There's many different venues you can go to for birding, and we'll kind of give you the ins and outs on how to pick places to go birding and how to prepare for those birding adventures. So we have a lot to cover tonight, so I don't want to belabor this too much, but I think we'll have a lot of fun, and we'll try to impress upon you just how much fun we have when we go out and we do these things. So take it away, Joe.
Okay. Did you want to get rid of the box?
No, we can do that up there. If you'd like to get rid of it, I can.
Oh, yeah. Why don't you do that?
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, Denis. So as birders, most of our birding we do close to home, whether it's our backyards or in DuPage Forest Preserves in northeastern Illinois. And then some of you also would venture out farther and enjoy, many parts of the United States and Canada. But for a lot of people, you don't think about international birding, and we just want to make the point that the world of birds extends really beyond our borders and really provides an opportunity to pursue our great hobby wherever we can go. So there's new lifers for you to see almost anywhere you travel. And that can be from the Arctic down through the forests of Europe, through the tropical forests and savannas, and even down to the tip of South America. There's always a world of birds that is just waiting to be discovered. So what we're going to cover tonight is bring you some information on birding outside our borders and provide an introduction to everybody about international birding. Now, for some of you, this may be new. Others have probably traveled just as much. I know we see lots of folks on the video that have gone on many of our trips, but hopefully it will provide information for everybody. And so what we're going to cover is, well, why would you even want to go on an international trip? Where are the birds? What's out there? And then talk about different options for planning, what different kinds of bird trips are out there, and then give you some tips on how you'd want to prepare for the birds, and finally end up with some examples of our favorite destinations and itineraries. So why do you want to consider birding around the world? Well, the answer is really there's an opportunity to see many new birds. There's really an abundance of lifers out there that await the birders who want to bird around the world. If you think about DuPage County, you can probably see about 300 birds here. within North America, I think the ABA area lists about 1,100, but internationally and throughout the world, there's probably about 11,000 species out there to see. So if you confine your birding just to the United States or North America, you're missing about 90% of the birds by not going out and doing an international trip. So there's great opportunities out there. And just as an example, when I went on my first birding trip with Denis, Ecuador, on my first day of birding, I had 104 new lifers. And during that 2-week trip, I think it was just like a little over 400 birds were seen. So that's the kind of new and exciting birds that you can find out there.
It's not going to behave.
So in addition to just the sheer numbers of birds, the diversity and adaptation of birds is around the world is really amazing. You can find some very many fascinating birds. For example, this was pictures that I took of a flame bowerbird in Papua New Guinea, and then the Hoatzin, which is native to the tropical forests of South America. So there are just so many different amazing birds out there, and Denis will cover those in more detail later on. But wait, in addition to the birds, there's more. While you're out there birding, you're also able to see a lot of other exotic and awesome wildlife. It's nothing like being out birding and hearing the roar of lions in the distance to keep you going. Next. Also, you can check off some of your bucket list locations. Through our birding trips, we've also been able to visit some just truly amazing places, whether it's going to the equator, seeing Machu Picchu in Peru, the savannas of Africa, or even the Angkor Wat in Cambodia. All those we're able to see on our birding trips, and that's another advantage of them as well. Another great thing is that you get to see what the rest of the world lives like. We're pretty isolated here in the US, and as we travel around on our birding ventures, we get to sample the foods, we get to see how the people are living, and so it is really fascinating to go around and see how things are in these various other countries.
I would like to interject and point out that in this scene here, you can't see it, but Joe actually ate a live grub. So just to get your appetite flowing here, a lot of cool things happening. Oh.
And then finally, you could always make new friends on your trip, whether it's the guides that you learn to favor, throughout the years. It's the group that you're birding with, some critters. There's always some great new friends among the birds. And as you can see, Denis always seems to attract the most unusual followers. So now Denis is going to give you some more details about the world of birds.
Thanks, Joe. So where are those birdiest places in the world? If you try to develop some kind of strategy on where you should plan your birding, and you want to maximize how many birds you're going to see, and that becomes kind of a game after a while, you need to know where all the birds are located. So I've given you a world map here, and you can see that there's some numbers slammed all across this map. And these are just general numbers. I mean, I think of this as a very high number, but it includes probably all the possible vagrants that have ever shown up in North America. So that, to me, that's kind of a high number. But if you look at South America, you can see there's really, really a lot of birds to be found there. It's probably the birdiest area that you can visit in the entire world. And we're very, very lucky. It's so convenient for us because it's so close. We can fly down here and we don't really have to worry about jet lag very much. It's quite different than trying to go to Africa or to Southeast Asia. You can see you have great numbers of birds in those areas as well. Europe, has a large number of birds. I haven't really delved into that pool of birds that much yet. So there's a lot of lifers waiting for me there. Australia certainly has a lot of birds, and you can go all the way even down to Antarctica, and you'll find some bird species down there as well. So to take a little closer look at South America, you can see which are the countries that really are the birdiest countries. And you can think of the equator. It says equator right there. So the equator is kind of blowing through right here. I think it's actually a little higher than that. I think it's up around here, closer to Quito. But at any rate, the equator is going through here, and you have the Andes kind of running along this way here. And those two things together dictate a lot of biodiversity. And so the countries that enjoy that the most would be places like Colombia or Ecuador or Peru, and then Brazil, just by the large landmass that it is and the extent of distance from the north all the way down to the south allows for it to have an awful lot of birds as well. But if you think for a minute about the fact that Ecuador is about the size of Colorado, this little country right here, it's the size of Colorado, and we're talking about 1,700 species of birds just in that one country. So it's quite a few. Its neighbors, Peru and Colombia, have even more, but they're about 5 times larger than Ecuador. But look at this, you're talking about almost 2,000 bird species just in one country. So that's pretty amazing. And as I mentioned before, it's right at our doorstep. It's very easy to get down into this continent, especially the northern half of it. Central America, likewise, is very easy and accessible for us. You can see there's a lot of birds here in Mexico. Go down to the other end of Central America, and there's a lot of birds here in Panama, and you have everything in between as well. So there's a lot of opportunities to find birds in those Central American countries. Likewise, in the Caribbean, we have a lot of opportunities, and it's great to hit a lot of these islands, because every time you go to an island, you're going to find some endemic species that are not found anywhere else except that island. So a trip to Jamaica, even though there's 327 birds, there's probably only about 27 of those birds that are unique to Jamaica. And so those are endemics. And the only way you're ever going to see those is if you make a little trip to Jamaica. So it's worthwhile doing that, especially if you're a hummingbird chaser like I am. When I went down there were 4 hummingbird species that I had never seen. And so that made the trip worthwhile just for that alone. So if you go to the Dominican Republic, you can see a comparable amount of species there. Get up in the Bahamas, there's even more, Cuba even more. But visiting all these different places takes time, but they're nice little short trips that you can make, and they are very close to the United States, so they're easy to get to. And some of them, like Puerto Rico, you don't even need a passport. So just so you have an understanding of what's out there, we have some really, really big bird families. And I've put some pictures up here just so you can relate to some of these. Eastern kingbird, which we're all familiar with, it's a representative of the tyrant flycatchers. It's the largest family in the world. There's roughly 436 species in that family. Tanagers, here's a really nice example. This is a flame-faced tanager. The tanagers in our alleys number 383. Old world warblers, which pale in comparison to our warblers, but they're still an interesting group. But there's 389 species there. Hummingbirds, to represent hummingbirds, I chose the giant hummingbird, just to give you some really odd perspective on this family. This is a hummingbird that you find in the Andes, and I've seen it in several different countries. It's a bird that's about the size of a starling. So think about your little ruby-throated hummingbirds that you see at your feeders, and then think about a starling and the size comparison there. So this is the largest hummingbird that there is, the giant. It's a pretty amazing bird. And then right next to it, people are all familiar with what parrots look like. This is a buff-faced pygmy parrot. And in that family of parrots, there are 350 species. This is probably the smallest one. In fact, I'm sure it's the smallest one. It's about the size of a kinglet. So think about that. You have a hummingbird, the giant hummingbird, that's probably better than 2 times the size of this parrot. So I think that's pretty amazing. And that's the whole point of this, is that there are all these amazing birds out there. Here's a spoonbill sandpiper representing the shorebirds. And this is a bird that we got to see in Thailand on our last trip. And it's probably the rarest shorebird in the world. So I wanted to give you an example. So, I'm talking about these really large numbers, and our introduction to tanagers is a pretty short one. We talk about scarlet tanagers and we talk about summer tanagers, and maybe some of us are familiar with western tanagers. And then beyond that, we're unfamiliar with the family. And as I mentioned, it's there's over 300 some species in the family. So here's just a small smattering, and you can see the diversity that you find in that family. They're pretty amazing birds. We think about our warblers as being really showy birds. Well, they can't hold a candle to what a lot of these tanagers look like. And here are some of the mythical birds that we chase when we travel around the country. And we sometimes pick destinations specifically just, searching for a particular bird. So here's a shoebill, a fascinating bird that I had wanted to put on my life list for a very, very long time, and finally did that on a trip to Uganda and Rwanda. And here's the white-necked Picasartes. The first time I saw a picture of this bird, I just knew instantly that I had to find it. It's a very interesting bird. If you look at this, all the caramel colored areas on the head of this bird, that's actually all skin. And the only areas that have any feathers is here on the nape. So it's almost like it's wearing an old leather football helmet. It's a fascinating looking bird. And they utilize mud nests on the faces of cliffs for nesting, and very, very difficult to get to. And once you've seen it, you've definitely earned it. Here's long wattled Lumberelle bird. This is the Amazonian species, I guess foothills of Amazonia. And it has this really long wattle that hangs down. It's all feathered, and it's just a really interesting looking bird. It has kind of an Elvis Presley mop on the top of it. Secretary birds are kind of an iconic bird of Africa. These really, really long legs, all the pin feathers coming out of the head. It's just a fascinating looking bird to me. Three-wattled bellbird. Has these long wattles hanging down, and the voice of this bird is just incredible. It carries forever, and it's just a really loud bong sound. And I just modified our program just minutes ago and put a hooded pitahui in this slide here. This is actually a poisonous bird. There's very, very few birds in the world that are poisonous, and all of them, as far as I know, are all found in Papua New Guinea. There's a few more interesting birds. The birds of paradise in general are all fascinating birds. They have such unusual courtship behaviors. But one of my favorites is the king of Saxony. It has these long feathers that come off of its head, and they actually, when they're doing courtship display, those actually rotate around and around. So it's an amazing thing to see. Here's a Papuan frogmouth, kind of hard to see, maybe, but the tip of the bill is right here where my cursor is, and you can see the eye right there. So it's sitting on a nest, and the tail is coming out this way here. We have southern brown kiwi as a bird I have yet to see, but I'm making plans to get down to New Zealand. Southern cassowary, which we did see in Australia, and it's a bird that's actually capable of killing us without poisoning us. This bird instead uses its feet. And here I have a close-up that I took of its feet, and you can see that it has these long spikes on the inside toe, and it'll actually kick you to death using those spikes. And a few more here. Here's the Andean cock the rock. I think people have seen pictures of that probably before. One of my favorites is the Rhinoceros Hornbill, just an amazing looking bird to see. Vulturine guinea fowls, oilbirds, which I think are another fascinating bird. This is the only nocturnal fruit-eating bird in the world. And here's another example of bowerbirds. Joe showed you one earlier. This is the Regent Bowerbird, and again, builds this elaborate altar for courtship. This is not used for nesting at all. This is simply put together by the male and decorated by the male. They'll put all sorts of little colored decorations all around it, and it's just to attract the female and impress her. So a lot going on, but none of this is actually used for nesting. So I also wanted to give you a little feel for just how big some of these families are that we take for granted here. We have representatives of all these different families, but our representation of them is very, very small. We only have one swift, the chimney swift, but there's actually 113 swifts in the world. We have a red-bellied woodpecker here. So we have maybe half a dozen woodpeckers that show up here in DuPage County, but there's actually 238 species of woodpeckers in the world. We shouldn't even have any starlings, but we do have one. And throughout the rest of the world, there's 123 species. Cuckoos, we have a couple of cuckoo species here, but there's 149 across the world. And wrens, we have about 5, but there are 88 of those. And we have only one kingfisher, but there are 114 of those. So our our perspective on the bird world is really pretty small compared to what's out there for us. We're going to kick it back to Joe here, and he has a few things to say.
Yep. So I think from what Dennis showed you, you can see, how the tremendous diversity and variety of birds is around the world. So how do you get started in trying to find some of them? Well, the next section of our presentation will give you some ideas on how to plan your trip and have a good experience. And of course, kind of the 4 things to start off with is first, pick a location, and then you need to start out by planning the transportation for your trip. Now, some of these areas are pretty remote, so not only do you have to take the airplane, but then you take a car somewhere and then on a boat even. So you have to figure out your mode of transportation. Then you have to think about your accommodations and what you're comfortable with. You want to find, I think, for the most part, a good guide, because your guide's going to lead you up and down the hills wherever you go. And so you want to make sure that they know what they're doing. And finally, you have to navigate the various regulatory requirements, such as passports and visas and health issues. So that's kind of the 4 areas that you have to start planning. So once you figure that you want to go somewhere, you really should consider the type of trip that you're interested in. And so I've kind of broken it down here into several. There's kind of the self-planned, self-guided trips. So that's something similar to what you would do if you wanted to go to someplace in the US. You gather information, you plan an itinerary, make all the reservations, and you serve as your own trip leader for the entire trip. Another option on international trips is if you feel a little like you need a little bit of help, you could essentially do a self-planned trip, but include in there some local guides for that extra help in the country that you're going with. That's particularly helpful if you're going to a foreign country where the language is different and traditions are different, and you would like some help in finding the birds. A third option is really the group birding trip, or you can kind of think about it as sign up and go. Here, what you need to do is kind of research your trips and look at all the commercial offerings that are out there, find out where you want to go, find the one that you like, and then sign up, and then show up for the trip. They're mostly, generally, normally all inclusive on the tours, so everything's taken care of, all your reservations, logistics. They provide local guides who know the destinations and the birds. So that's a very good way to go. So how you, or some considerations in the group birding tours, really have to know about what the intensity of the birding is, because some tours can be pretty casual and others can be birding 24/7. That's all you do and you're going full speed ahead. You also have to think about and research kind of what kind of accommodations they're offering. Is it a luxury tour where you're in 5-star lodges, or is it more of a rustic tour, getting into some less than ideal lodging conditions, but probably closer to the birds? You also have to consider the group size, how big a group there is, and then whether there's friends or strangers. Some of the group tours, you could do a private tour and get all your friends to go, people that you know, and another tours you're going to be together with strangers. So if you're going to be together with those folks for a long time, you want to think about whether that's something that you want to do. And to figure out which one you want, I think you have to consider costs. What can you afford? What would you like to spend? The guided tours, of course, tend to be more expensive because they include a lot more things. You have to decide whether the added cost is worth it. There's planning and logistic issues. If you're thinking about self-planning, do you want to take on all the tasks of planning and booking all the reservations in an international setting? all by yourself in a foreign country? Or is it better to have a professional do that? I think that depends a lot on the destination. One of the issues that I think is important is, you have to think about what happens if a problem develops on the trip. This is where the group birding tours, I think, is very advantageous, because if there's a problem, they're going to help you they're going to take care of it. They have the experience. They probably have good contacts there within the country. They normally know what to do, can help fix that problem. So, whether it's something, some reservation trouble or transportation trouble or sickness or illness or something, they're going to be there to help you out, as opposed to you being stuck in the middle of some rainforest without a way of communicating. So we don't want to do that. Then you also have to figure out what kind of birder you are, about fitting in with the group of folks, how that is. I think language is an issue. I think some places where English is not widely used, and if you don't have the language skills, that could be a problem. And a really important consideration is you're gonna end up going out to this location, and you want to think about your ability to find birds. Can you find the birds that you're targeting on your own? So if you have your heart set on going to South America and seeing a harpy eagle, well, good luck with that if you don't have a local guide to help you out. So I think the most important advantage of a group or guided tour is the local guides, because they really know where the birds are and how to find them. So in the end, you need to weigh those pros and cons and identify the trip that's best for you. So Denis is going to talk now a little about the resources for planning a trip and some steps to prepare before you get there.
There's been a lot of advancements as far as information that's available to us. Just with the internet, there's just so many different resources out there now. When I planned my very first trip to Costa Rica back in 1994, I accomplished all of the logistics, setting up all my lodging and everything, all through a fax machine. And so the turnaround on that was, just terrible. I mean, you would fax your questions, and then it would go down to the local lodge. Someone there who didn't speak English saw your fax, and so they had to get somebody to translate it so they could figure out what you were asking, and then they would come up with an answer, and then somebody would have to translate that back to English, and then they would fax it back to you. And sometimes that would take, days or even a week. And so that was very frustrating. Nowadays, we have all this information at our fingertips, and there's just so many resources out there. One that I often go and visit, it's called the Fat Birder. And so they do provide a lot of information. And here's a list of some of the things that you'll find for every country out there. They'll have a country checklist. There'll be some useful reading for that country, birding apps that apply to that country, reserves that are found within the country, guides and tour operators that operate within that country, trip reports, and there can be quite a few trip reports. And the best thing to do is, if you're planning to go in July, you can look at trip reports that were from a trip in December, but the availability of some of the birds may change quite a bit between July and December. So there's so many trip reports out there, though, you should be able to find several that would fit the time frame when you're planning to go. And if you don't find any and they're all in another time period, well, maybe you're going in the wrong time period. So they'll also tell you places to stay, and there's a lot more information. So you can do a lot of research on your own. Another thing that you can do is there's all these really big birding tour companies out there. Wings is really big, Field Guides, Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours, Tropical Birding. So you can go visit their websites and you can look and see what kind of offerings they have. And so if they have an itinerary that they run in a country that you were hoping to visit, you can look and see where they go. How much time do they spend in each one of those areas, and what parts of the country do they target? You can compare and contrast between the different travel companies, and you'll find that there'll be a lot of situations where they're actually going to the same places. So now you know that that's probably really a hot spot, and it's probably something that you want to include in your itinerary. So there's other resources that are out there on the internet. You can go to the CDC website, and this is a great place to find out, gee, do I need a inoculation for yellow fever? Do I need to get a prescription for malaria medications or other things. I mean, there's many different things that are out there. And for some of them, they might suggest that you should get something for typhoid, or lots of times they say, well, you should probably get a rabies shot. So you have to kind of weigh what you're going to be doing and make some decisions on your own on, do I really need a rabies shot? To me, the best thing to do is just avoid petting dogs and things like that. And you're probably not going to come in contact with too many wild animals. So I guess your biggest concern would maybe be running into bats or something like that. And that's probably pretty unlikely. So I weigh those things as I look at the website, and it gives me a lot of information. Some of these things are broken down to the point where, if you're going to, let's say, South Africa, there are probably parts of South Africa where definitely you want to have malaria medication, but there's a lot of parts of South Africa where you don't need that. So depending on what your itinerary is, if you just glanced at it and it said, malaria in South Africa, and you start taking those pills, well, maybe you really didn't need them. So there is enough detail in a lot of these country descriptions that will tell you specifically, what you need to do. So it's great to, use this as a resource and see what's out there. Another resource that I always look at is to look at the State Department's descriptions of all these countries, and there'll be travel advisories. There'll be all sorts of information on safety, and so you should read through that, and that will help you make your decision as well. But what I would like you to understand is that these descriptions are usually written to protect everybody in every kind of situation. And so a lot of the stuff may not apply to you because of where you're going to be in the country or the kinds of traveling you're going to be doing. If you are working with a tour company, you kind of have these handlers in place that are keeping you out of harm's way because they don't want to get shot at or anything either. So that can make a big difference. And as you read these things, you should probably go to other countries' travel department or travel departments and look and see what they say about visiting Chicago or visiting Miami or visiting LA. And you'll find that there's a lot of stuff that's written about us that after reading it, you would never want to visit your own cities in your own country. So you have to keep that in mind when you're reading these things. We're going to go back to Joe.
Okay, well, I just want to give some thoughts on some tips on international birding, and particularly on the getting there and back. And so I think that there's a lot of things to think about in these trips, and I think a lot of it is just common sense. First of all, in making your travel plans, try and look at all the alternatives available and see what happens or what's available if something goes wrong, because in many places outside the US, in some of these countries, the idea and concepts of schedules and timelines is much different than what we're used to here in the US, particularly if you're in any remote or rural areas. You want to make sure that if you're flying by air anywhere, that you allow more than enough time for air connections. Something with flights can always go wrong, and so it's better to be waiting at an airport for a couple hours than miss a critical connection and end up missing half of your trip. You want to know the destination country health and safety requirements, because some of the countries are pretty strict on customs, and so you can get things confiscated out of your luggage that you never would have thought of before. So just know that and be aware of those. And then you want to pack to survive for several days without luggage. It's always a good idea to, and I think this is whether you're birding or not, but make sure you have a couple days at least of clothes and change of clothes and all your critical items, including your binoculars, with you. So make sure you pack them to take that with your onboard luggage, because you can end up on some of these trips that are complicated, luggage not showing up for several days. We know that from personal experience. So, and then I think for international trips, especially nowadays, you really should have travel insurance. You think about travel insurance as being something that covers travel delays or lost luggage, et cetera. But really, the most important part of travel insurance is the international healthcare coverage, and then also the coverage for having to be evacuated in case something happens and you need to get back home. So that's really what is really worthwhile about that.
Okay, so I have a few things to say about the preparation as well. Nowadays, it's pretty easy to find field guides for just about anywhere in the world. Sometimes there'll be regional guides, like here we have birds of the West Indies, or here's Southern Africa, here's the Indian subcontinent, here's Europe. So they cover regions, but then there's also field guides that'll cover specific countries. Here's Ecuador, Thailand, Australia, Costa Rica. So there's all sorts of different versions that you can utilize in order to prepare for your trip. When we first started doing trips to Ecuador, there were no field guides for Ecuador, so we used to use the Colombia guide, and it was very effective. It covered most of the birds that we needed to see or understand before we went on our trip. We did a trip to Bolivia at one point in time, and there was no field guide at all for Bolivia, so we ended up creating our own field guide. We actually cut and pasted a whole bunch of plates together, put together a whole set of the birds that we anticipated seeing, and then we bound that. We actually copied it and made sure that everybody on the trip had that available to them. So that was a resource that we were able to put together for ourselves pretty easily. So when I do prepare for a trip, and my trips for the most part are organized trips, we usually have a group of friends that are traveling together. On occasion, it's just me and Melissa traveling, but quite often, most of my birding trips are group efforts, and I utilize a tour company that will take care of all the logistics for me. That's typically field guides, and I can utilize all of their past trip information and actually put together a study list based on their past performances using either the same itinerary or a similar itinerary. So in this example here, here's a bunch of birds that we have listed. This was for a trip to Thailand. And so based on their performances over the previous 4 trips, I can mark whether or not they actually got that bird. And so we refer to these birds as 4Xs, and this would be a 1X, this would be a 1X, a 2X, and so on and so on. So you can actually help establish some expectations on what birds you might see based on how often they get that bird. So you can see Joe right here, he's studying very hard so that he knows all the differences between those little babblers. Back to Joe.
So again, I think preparation is great for your international trip, and here's just some ideas on preparing a packing list essentially. And you want to bring all your essentials on there. You want to check, make sure you have all your documents, check what the weather is going to be like and the conditions up there. And then I actually like to write it down, and then I check things off as I'm putting it in my luggage. And again, just a reminder, very important, bring all essentials on your carry-on luggage. So then international birding can be quite different than what we're used to here in the US. First, in some areas, the travel can be difficult. We've run into landslides that have closed roads. We've come across trees across roads. We've had a vehicle break down and like hours away from any location. So you just have to be prepared for these, and things are going to happen. And you have to be prepared to go with the flow in such situations. Itineraries are going to change, and so you just have to be prepared to be flexible. Another thing is, when you're out there in a location for a day or two, and it might be raining, and if it's not like here where if it's bad weather, you're just going to decide not to go out down there. If you're out in some remote location, staying for a day or two, and there's some particularly good birds you want to try and find, you know, you're going to have to go out and bird in the rain and do the best you can. So always be prepared for that. And then, you know, accommodations are, you know, might not be what you expect. Pictures on the internet of all these lodges and stuff really look great, but you know, the things can always be different. So just remember, check things out ahead of time and be prepared for that. And then finally, you know, the actual birding itself can be difficult. We're used to pretty easy conditions here in DuPage County, where the birds are fairly cooperative and the vegetation isn't very thick. But in some locations, you know, the vegetation in the rainforest can be very thick. The birds can be very skittish, and you'll be lucky to see a small jungle dwelling bird for a couple of seconds as it skulks through an opening that's by you. So you have to be prepared for a really different birding experience and kind of adjust your expectations. So now we're going to go through some examples of birding trips that we've had, just to get an idea of what's out there.
And so I've got a couple trips I want to talk about. My favorite country to travel in is Ecuador. I've been down there 10 times, so I have a lot of connections down there, and it's pretty easy for me to put together a trip. So I did this similar itinerary 2 times in a row. I visited Ecuador in 2015 and then again in 2018. And the trip in 2015 was just Melissa and I, and we had another couple that joined us, and it was supposed to be a non-birding trip. And what we did on that particular trip is we flew into Quito, and we stayed nearby in the town of Puembo, that's near the airport. And we started out from there. The very first morning, we went over the Andes here. And so we were birding our way through the Papua Pass, which is a famous birding area. And as we got onto the other side of the Andes, we're still at pretty high elevation, but we visited the Guango Lodge for lunch, and then continued on down to San Isidro, which is a favorite spot of mine on the east slope of the Andes. And we stayed there, I think, 3 nights. And then I believe we spent another 3 nights at Wild Sumaco Lodge. And then we worked our way eastward or northward along the Loreto Road, which is another famous birding location within Ecuador. And we made it all the way to the town of Coca, which is about here. And from there, you jump on a river. And so you're on a boat for about 2 or maybe 2.5 hours until you get to your lodges. And a lot of the lodges are situated in this general area here. This particular lodge is on the south side of the Rio Napo. And that's significant because all of my other trips to this region, I've always been staying on the north side. And there is a different suite of birds. There's a lot of overlap, but there's also a suite of birds that you're only going to find on the south side. And then there's a different suite of birds that you'll find only on the north side. So this Napo River is really a huge river. It's like the Mississippi River. Even though it's just a tributary of the Amazon, it's a huge river. And so that geographic barrier is what prevents some of these birds from moving from one side to the other. So this itinerary, the way it's set up, we were working our way down, all the way from up here high in the Andes. We worked our way all the way down into Amazonia. So it involved many elevations, which increased our chance for varying species. This was supposed to be a non-birding trip, and the guy I'm allowing to enter right now, Mark Frigo, he was actually on this trip, and he said to me, after the wives defined this as a non-birding trip, he said, I'm really getting into birding. I'd like to see all the birds we can while we're on this trip. So the non-birding trip kind of became a birding trip. And we ended up on this short itinerary, we ended up still getting 295 species. And it wasn't just the casual species, we were getting some of the really good species. So we managed to get some of the iconic targets that you'd be looking for when you're in the Andes. So we did get things like torrent duck, and we did get black mandibled toucans. There's Mark right there. And here's me, here's Melissa. And so we're actually birding through Papua Pass. We had a dedicated driver for us. So that got us from point A to point B as we worked our way through that itinerary. And I had arranged for at least 1 day's worth of local guides at every destination. So we didn't always have a guide with us, but we at least had enough guided birding so that we could understand where the birds were and we knew what we wanted to accomplish. Here's a golden mantled tamarin, which we had down in Amazonia. And overall, we had 8 species of monkeys on the trip. So we did very well with that. Here's those Watsons that you find when you get down into rainforests in the Amazon, and so they're quite frequently found. And we did have them on this trip. We had some nice night monkeys, but we also picked up some birds that are really hard to get a good look at. This is the Zigzag Heron. It's a nocturnal heron. It's probably the best picture or the best view I've ever had of this bird. And here it was, supposedly a non-birding trip. And to give you a little feel for what some of our hiking and birding was like, here we are working our way through a forest at San Isidro. So in doing that itinerary, where I had set up the whole thing myself, we really didn't have much assistance other than we arranged for a driver, and we did arrange for some local guides. We got a lot of the low-hanging fruit by doing that, but I saw that there was a lot of potential on this itinerary. So I decided to run it again in 2018, but this time I ran it through field guides as an organized tour, and we had several people sign up for the trip. So I think we probably had a team of about 8 people or something like that on this trip. And someone suggested that we do a little pre-trip, and so we jumped over, instead of just staying on the east slope of the Andes, we jumped over to the west slope. And so our first visit after leaving Quito was to go on the west slope, and we went to an area in the Mindo Valley, and we stayed at a lodge called Septimo Paraiso, and it's a nice little lodge. I've stayed there before. They do have some nice hummingbird feeders there, and there's a lot of places on the west slope of the Andes where there are a lot of feeding stations available that you can visit, and so I highly recommend doing that. But then we popped back over to Quito, specifically to Puembo, and there we picked up the rest of the group that didn't do the pre-trip. And once again, we worked our way across the Papiacta Pass. This time we actually stayed at Goango Lodge for a couple of nights. And then we worked our way down to San Isidro again, to Wild Sumaco, and then worked our way on the Loreto Road once again, and to Coca, and then down the river for 2 to 2.5 hours. And this time we went to Sani Lodge, which is on the north side of the Rio Napo. So once again, this involved many elevations with increased species potential, and we added that west slope pre-trip, so that made a big difference. And in the end, even though this trip was probably about 3 days longer than the trip I did in 2015, we ended up almost doubling our number of species, and we had 524 species that included what we saw on the pre-trip. Here's one of my favorite hummingbirds, and we did see this on the west slope of the Andes, but it does have a counterpart on the east slope. And here's red-headed barbet. This was at a feeding station, so you could do some great photography. But on this 14-day trip, we actually ended up with 66 hummingbird species on the one trip. And so that's the most hummingbirds I've ever seen on a 2-week trip for sure. Pretty amazing. And here's chestnut crowned antpitta, pretty cool bird. Antpittas are notoriously hard to find and get to cooperate and come out to a tape. But people have been actually training them to come into feeding stations, and so it's changed the whole ball game as far as finding antpittas. And you can actually see 5 antpittas in one day now, or it would take you a whole week to accomplish that in the past. Here's crimson rump toucanet again at a feeding station. We had a nice place for Andean condors, and here we are doing a little birding at Wild Sumaco Lodge. Since I have been down there so many times, I run into people again and again. And this is a longtime friend of mine. His name is Oscar, and I actually met him for the first time in the late 90s on my very first trip to Sasha Lodge, where he works. Here's some examples. Toucan barbet is a near endemic for Ecuador. It's a really great looking bird. Crested owls, lowland owl species that they're very reliable as far as their roost sites. So if you're at a lodge and they know where they're at, that's an easy bird to get. They'll just take you right to it. And Joe had mentioned making new friends. Well, here's John Doerr's back. Now, those of you that know John Doerr, he's a pretty big guy, and this walking stick is stretching more than halfway across his back. So an incredibly large walking stick, largest one I've ever seen. And this was our team. And it's nice to be able to travel with a bunch of people that you know. Prior to this, I was in Ecuador in January of 2018 as well. And I was on a tour where I didn't know anyone. And it was just the whole dynamics was just totally different than when you can travel with a lot of friends. So I really loved doing it this way. And it's easy to put together a private tour and work with a company to do that. So another trip that I did, which was a slightly different example, in this case, We're now in Africa, so we visited Uganda and Rwanda. Once again, it was supposed to be a non-birding trip. The main targets were to see mountain gorillas and chimpanzees in the wild. And so those were big targets for us. But being a birder, this is probably the best country you can visit in the entire world and see the shoebill. So we flew into Entebbe, and there's a location right off of Lake Victoria called the Mamamba Swamp area. It's probably one of the most accessible places where you can be pretty much guaranteed seeing a shoebill. So I included an entire day dedicated to just looking for shoebill. And then from there, we proceeded and spent several days in the Queen Elizabeth Murchison Falls area. That's another good place where you can find shoebills. In fact, I had them there on 2 separate days. So in the end, I ended up seeing a total of 5 shoebills. So that was quite incredible. We visited the Kabali Forest, which is down here, and that's where you get your chimpanzees. We went to Queen Elizabeth National Park. That's where you have the famous lions that actually sit in trees. And then we went down to the windy, impenetrable forest. And that's a place where you can also do gorilla viewing, but we were instructed that it was a good idea to go into Rwanda. It's supposed to be easier to see them there. So we did go into Rwanda to get our, excuse me, to get our mountain gorillas. And we got those in Volcano National Park. And then we flew out of Kigali. So it was a very easy trip to do. We did have a dedicated driver that took us the entire way. He was somewhat bird knowledgeable, but he was even more knowledgeable knowing his limitations. And so for a lot of the key places we visited, he actually arranged for us to have local guides. And so we had some really top-notch guides taking us for a day and birding in some of these locations. So again, a variety of habitats with primarily safari in mind, but we did do a lot of birding. And once again, a non-birding trip, but we still managed to get 299 species of birds. So here's that fantastic shoebill that I wanted to see so badly. And I mean, just close-up views of that bird. Here we all are on the equator. So this is Melissa and I, and we traveled with Roberta and Ira Asher. So that was our little group, nice small group of 4. This is our vehicle we traveled in the whole time with our dedicated driver. And quite often, wherever available, we would arrange a walking safari, which I think is a must. You can do some better birding that way, and then just seeing all of the wildlife from that perspective as opposed to being in a Jeep is really rewarding. Just a few examples of some of the birds that we came across. Pretty easy to see things like red-throated bee-eater, dark chanting goshawk is pretty easy to come up with. Many kingfishers available there. This one happens to be an African pygmy kingfisher, and then we have a leopard there. So here we are doing our chimpanzee trek, looking for chimpanzees, and they put you in small groups and you go out looking for a troop of chimpanzees that has been habituated to people, and so they won't run away. But you can see you're in thick vegetation. There are no trails. You're kind of just tromping along. The guides are working their way, and they kind of know where they should be looking. You do travel with armed guards in case you come across wildlife that is not so friendly. But then you get to see chimpanzees, and it was pretty incredible. We happened to have a troop of 8 females that were just lounging on this log, and they were all doing all the chimpanzee type things you would expect. It was a fascinating experience. Some more of those iconic birds like gray-crowned cranes, African fish eagle, and then we had some other things that you're probably likely to see as well. Pink-backed pelican, white-thighed hornbill is probably a toughie. You have to be in a pretty specific place to get that, but it was a cool bird, and it represents the fact that there are many different hornbills. So here's one of those lions that sits up in the tree. Pretty fascinating to see that. And we had things like colobus monkey, which probably pretty easy to get. But we did get African crake, which is a hard bird to get. Even though it was not a birding trip, we still ended up getting some pretty cool birds. And waddled lapwings are something that would be pretty readily available too. And then once we got into Rwanda, we did find our primary target, which was the mountain gorillas. And the way they run those, again, it's a small group. There's only 8 people allowed in a group, and they assign you to a specific troop, and then your guide will take you to that troop. So you have a guide, and then you'll have 2 armed guards, and you'll have 3 trackers that are working to make sure they know where the gorillas are located that morning. And you can hire Sherpas to carry your backpack or whatever, which is not necessary, but if you're hiring somebody out of the local village, it's really good because you're helping to support that community. So I encouraged everybody in our group of 8 to hire somebody, and everybody did. So it was great. But even while you're watching gorillas, which is pretty fascinating, there still are birds popping in and out. And I recall seeing a white-starred robin while we were watching those gorillas. So it was pretty cool. What's nice is even if it's not a birding trip, every time you have a new destination for lodging, there's going to be a lot of vegetation around that particular lodge, and you'll always find birds in those locations. So any of your downtime you can spend just walking around all the lodge buildings or tents or whatever you happen to be in, and there'll be lots of birds available. And on this particular trip, we had quite a variety of lodgings. Many of our destinations or locations had just tents, but they're not what you think of as a tent. I mean, they had, some of them even had air conditioning. So they're pretty modern looking tents. All the luxuries you could possibly imagine in a 5-star hotel, but they're under canvas. So now I'm going to turn it over to Joe. He's got a couple of trips that he's going to talk about just to give you some more ideas on different ways and different options for bird travel.
Yeah, I did talk about, places where you might be able to do a self trip. And I think good examples of those might be Europe, where obviously there's a good transportation and lodging infrastructure. And then I think a lot of Europeans know English, or, can usually find someone of English speaking, and probably a lot of the signage is in English. So Europe is a good example. Another place close by is Costa Rica, which has a very good tourist infrastructure down there. And I think they have, if you don't know Spanish, I think you can make your way around pretty well with English signage and directions, things like that. So those might be good places where you want to do a self-tour. But I did want to talk about a good example of a commercial tour. This was a trip that we went on last year to Thailand. Having a tour company arrange all this was just great, because you fly into Bangkok, and then you go to several locations from that, either by vehicle, which we did going south along the coast, or then to the east there to another part of central Thailand. And then there was air arrangements to fly up north, and we did a couple of boat trips and things like that. So there was a lot of planning that went into this, and it was good to have that all taken care of and by people who know what they were doing. And so this is our group again. We were able to visit many of the national parks there. There's a picture of us looking for the Spoonbill Sandpiper, which we spent an afternoon at, making sure we did get that very rare bird. And there was our guide at the scope, who has, I think, had been to Thailand many, many times. And a picture of Siamese fireback, which is a national bird. But the picture in the middle is of a gentleman named Watt, and he was our local guide. And
what's his name?
What? And he and his family essentially just did everything for us. And my estimation, he was the best local guide ever, because not only he was able to find us lots of birds, he did all the cooking, which was excellent. And we arranged to have these great Thai meals with several different kinds of entrees.
What the hell did I lose the damn sound?
Well, out in the middle of the field, so we didn't have to go back and waste time. And then he just did a wonderful job of coordinating, getting us all together. So that was great. Here's just some of the birds, and the chickens we saw out in the middle of wild chickens, so the red jungle fowl, but just a lot of different birds. And again, example of us having the dinner in the field, which was at night when we're out looking for some owls and places. And again, that's the kind of things that local guides can do for you. Again, some more of the birds, pied hornbill. One in the center there is Hogston's frogmouth, which again was on a day roost. And so that was great. They knew where the Chinese egret was. And then the great thing is, again, we were able to see when we were in Bangkok, the Royal Palace and Grounds. And at the time that we went, it was just the beginning of the COVID situation. And for us, we were lucky because that temple grounds was usually crowded with Chinese visitors, and there was hardly anybody around, so you could get great views and pictures of the reclining Buddha there, which was a great sight. And then we visited a number of other temples, and I like this picture of a monk using probably a steel air blower to clean off the stairs for us. So that was good. Another final example is Papua New Guinea. This is where a tour company was absolutely essential. We started out by trying to make our own arrangements and couldn't really get anything done. It was just impossible to communicate with people there. And Papua New Guinea is very isolated and remote. You know, there's essentially no roads across the country, and you had to fly from every place. So we went to 3 different locations besides around Port Moresby, where we flew into from Australia. But every time we went out someplace, we had to come back to Port Moresby on air flights, and sometimes they just didn't fly and they canceled. So, but it was a very interesting trip. Next. So obviously what you go to Papua New Guinea for was to see all the birds of paradise, which we were able to see in many locations, but it was a lot of work, a lot of hard birding to find some of these birds. And then also saw other rare species such as tiger parrots and a couple other things, but it was tough birding there. We had all the birds are very skittish and stay far away because they're still hunted for their plumes, for the adornment of the Aboriginal folks there. So it was very hard to see them, but having the guides, knowing where specific birds were, and essentially, I think paying to protect them was really the only way you're going to see anything. And then just a shot of the mountainous terrain that you have to go through. Samuel there was our local expert and guide, and Samuel was essentially the key to birding in New Guinea. Pretty much all the tours use him, and he was also the guide for when David Attenborough did his Birds of Paradise. So Samuel was the local expert, and he kind of was the gatekeeper, so we were lucky to have him. But just an idea of the birding conditions, you can see very thick habitat, trying to point out a bird that's in the top of the trees there with a guide, and it was just very, very difficult birding. Then also, there are situations in New Guinea that were relatively dangerous. I mean, this was a shot of when we flew into Mount Hagen up in the highlands, and there, I think pretty much the whole town comes out to greet the airplanes, but you don't know. It was kind of scary going through that whole crowd. And so again, it was good to have the folks there who knew how to do it, because they still practice kind of eye for eye justice up there. And we had a driver who couldn't go to one particular place because he was having a feud with, or his family was having a feud with villagers in that area. So it just wasn't safe for him to go, but it's really worked out well, or really a necessity to have a guide in a situation like that where the local conditions are very difficult. A couple more pictures. Victoria Crown Pigeon. Here's a Papuan frogmouth again, Regent Whistler, and then we had one place we were going to look for some owl, and it had rained, and so the local villagers were agreed to build us little bridges over the streams, and so that was again one way where having the local guides really who knew these folks and could get them to do that was very good.
There's a J there.
I think you could.
Okay. We're fighting over the last slide. So basically, I guess the story that we're trying to tell you is that the opportunities are endless. We had a short amount of time. We actually came in under an hour, which was our goal. And we did cover quite a bit. And hopefully we've given you a little bit of a sample of what's out there. We have many, many stories to share. But if we talked about all of that, we would be here all night. I have some pretty humorous stories about Samuel. And actually, many of the characters that you've seen in some of these slides, just, things that, would really just make you wonder what is really happening before your very eyes. And Joe was talking about Papua New Guinea and how, it seemed like it was potentially dangerous. And it was potentially dangerous. Probably the only place out of all the places I've traveled in the world, it's the only place I ever felt intimidated. Everywhere else I've gone, I've felt very, very comfortable, even going to places, that in the press, there's been so much talk, or had been always so much talk about, things going on in Colombia or even things going on in Peru. But I have visited those countries, and it's easy to get around, and the people are very, very friendly. So the locals know how to keep you out of the parts of the country that maybe there are still some difficulties. And you have to do a little bit of research, and you can't believe everything you hear in the press when you're planning your trips. But the opportunities are certainly endless. As we tried to show you, there's just so many different, different birds out there, things that, for the North American birder, it's really hard to relate to waterfowl that look like this. We certainly don't have penguins. We don't know what the heck mannequins are unless we go to the department store. And of course, that's spelled differently. So, and hornbills. I mean, there's just so many different things that, it's difficult for us to relate to these birds. So hopefully we've shared enough with you so you get a feel for just some of the things that are out there. And I hope we maybe planted the seed, and you might want to try some of these trips out. It's really a lot of fun. So I'm going to stop the share here, and we can see everybody again. And Steve, if you would like to go through the chat and let us know if there's any questions in there. Otherwise, we'll make up stuff and we'll start telling some of those stories.
Okay. Well, you can't tell too much because Daphne's on them.
Okay.
We'll keep them clean. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, both of you, Denis and Joe. For those who need even more of a taste of international birds, I find Instagram to be the place where I'm constantly wishing I was, with the people who are posting these pictures. And the good thing about it is I've made a lot of friends in Singapore and all over the places. So if I ever do manage to get to those places, I'll be able to go birding with all these wonderful flycatchers and kingfishers and things that I see posted. So thanks for sharing a lot of the basics and giving us so many tempting details too, with all those pictures. And I know there's plenty more stories, so hopefully we'll have more chances to hear them casually, and who knows, maybe future presentations. So lots of thank yous are coming in. Natalie has a couple questions. I don't know if she wants to ask them herself. She's entitled to.
Well, I was just curious on these trips, but I think you might have sort of answered it. Did you mostly do all self-planning, or did you work through groups, a group tour kind of thing to help you out? Because boy, the planning would be.
Well, we tried to show you a variety of things. So, like, for example, I had those 2 trips to Ecuador. So one of them was I came up with the itinerary, but I have contacts in Ecuador. So I contacted them and said, here's what I want to do. There's going to be 4 of us. Here's where we're going to go. I set all that up myself through someone that I knew in Ecuador. And so that ran very smoothly, and it was my itinerary. So, I put all of that together. I knew the lodges, I knew where I wanted to stay. I knew what birds I wanted to search for, things like that. And so then when I ran it in 2018, I said, I ran this itinerary. It was pretty good. What does your guide think about it? And their guide is a guy named Mitch. He's a good friend of mine. So he did modify it a bit. And we threw that little pre-trip thing on there. But we actually ran that trip through Field Guides, which is a tour company. They most likely used the exact same people that I used to set up my itinerary. It's a group called Bird Ecuador, and that used to be a company owned by Mitch. But he has now handed it off to his sister-in-law, and so she does. Anybody can contact Bird Ecuador, and they will set up a bird trip for you. You could, if you wanted to go to Ecuador and do it all on your own, I would suggest doing it through Bird Ecuador. And you would ask for Irene, and Irene will take very good care of you. So, you know, all the examples, when I do a big trip where there's, you know, 8 or more, you know, usually it's somewhere between 8, 10, maybe 11 people. Those are, I don't do those myself. I do those through field guides. And so I let them handle all the logistics, and then, you know, I find the people and get everybody interested in the trip, basically. So hopefully that answers that. And Joe might have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, all the trips I've been on have been through a tour company, so I've never done any, you know, of my own planning on my own. So
Even Europe? Did you go through a tour company when you went to Europe, or did you?
no, that was when I went to Europe. It was actually on a business trip,
Oh, okay.
and I did some birding on the side. So
Okay. Well, thank you. I did have one more question, and this is maybe like an obvious question. I don't know, or obviously, but you know, when you're heading down these trails and looking for birds and things, are these like national parks in these companies that have trails like a national park here, and you're kind of following a trail, or are you more kind of bushwhacking it, or is it depend where you're at?
Yes.
Yeah.
So quite often you're in a national park. That can happen, and we've done a lot of that. Some of these places there are no trails. If you're in Amazonia, one of the things that you might do in order to get some very specific birds is to go island hopping. So these rivers are huge, and there's actually islands within the river. There are species that are specific to those islands, and that's the only place you'll find them. You won't find them, you know, back on shore. They're only found on these islands because they're taking advantage of a specific habitat that develops as these islands grow and move down the river. That's another whole story in itself. So when you land on one of these islands, there are no trails. So, you know, you got a guy going ahead of you with a machete, and he's, you know, cutting a trail for you. I remember one time we were doing one of those, and so we're working our way along, and the guy is slashing away, and so I'm following. Everybody's in line, and we're all following. I happen to look down, and there's because I saw somebody asked about snakes, and there was a snake skin that probably is as long as my dining room table. It was probably 7 feet long or something like that, and you know, the snake would have been about this big around or something. We never saw the snake. We only saw the snake skin. You do have a lot of that, and then you also have, you know, they have connections within the country, and so they have private properties that they make a deal with the landowner. So the landowner is not utilizing their land for farming. Instead, they're keeping it natural. And so the tour companies, you know, will go to those guys, and they offer money to be able to bring people on their property. But that helps. That's the incentive for them to not, you know, turning it into ag. So there's a lot of, you know, both of those things going on. Joe, do you have any input on it?
yeah, I mean, the other thing is, you know, actually a lot of the time, at least in South America, we're birding off of roads, you know, dirt roads.
That's a good point too. Yeah.
So that they're, you know, going throughout the country, and they just know that there's certain places where there are good concentrations of birds. So you're actually walking on roads which are generally not used much at all. So, but that's a good part of what we do with birding as well.
So a lot of Papua New Guinea, we've mentioned a couple of times how that's kind of a scary place to go. When you're in good hands, it's fine. So there were situations where you couldn't go on, you know, you wouldn't dare go on somebody's property. That would be an absolute no-no, and you could get killed for that. You literally could get killed for going on somebody's property. We were actually birding along. In fact, it was the place where we did get one of our pygmy parrots. And there was a man who approached our group, and he was demanding money because we were looking at his property. So that's where your handlers come in handy. So they take care of that guy and you continue birding. So, good question though, Natalie. Yeah. I did see somebody did, I saw a comment come up as I was talking, and somebody said snakes with a question mark.
Yeah.
We almost never see snakes. We almost never see snakes. I see more snakes in Florida than I see anywhere else. When I hear that somebody says, "Oh, there's a snake," I run to it because it's like we seldom see them. When I did that tour where it was the non-birding tour to Ecuador, the one in 2015, that we seemed to have great success with snakes. And it must have been because we weren't birding all the time. So we did see more snakes there. But for the most part, I don't see a lot of snakes.
Okay.
And we seldom run into things that are venomous, although I do remember Diane stepping on a fer-de-lance or making contact with a fer-de-lance in Belize, and that's a bad one.
Mm.
I hope that
It
carries
didn't bite her.
forward. Oh, yeah,
What's
good.
that, Steve?
I hope it carries forward as when you go to Australia. So.
Sure. We've been to Australia a couple times, and
Oh, yeah. Okay.
we saw. Did we see any snakes when we were in Australia?
Yeah, we have a couple.
Did we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wouldn't be Australia without something like that. So, Mary asked earlier about. She says, "How long should you plan for?" And I think that was in the context of, like, what if your luggage is lost or things? How much did you carry on? Like, how long have you been kind of without your things? Have you ever had situations?
I
like
think this
that?
is in your
This
wheelhouse.
is in my
Jim.
wheel. So, the longest time was when we went to South Africa, and because of weather issues, some of us were delayed and had to take another flight, and
Completely different.
completely different route. And so there were 4 of us who didn't get our luggage, I think, for 4 days. I mean, eventually got there, and they delivered. They delivered. The airline actually had it delivered to us. We were out on the road somewhere. They found us and met him at a shopping center or something. But so that was the longest, like 4 days that I can think of. I think a couple other times it's been 2 or 3 days that people have not gotten it. So at least 2 or 3 days of stuff to make sure you can keep on birding while your luggage is finding you.
So in your carry-on, I mean, I'll throw on the clothes I'm wearing, and plus maybe a couple of shirts and another pair of pants and some underwear. And it's hard to get the toiletries across, obviously, but those are things you can easily replace. But that's enough for you to just keep cycling through. You're in these environments where we're all in the same boat, so you don't have to. It's not a fashion show. So if you're in the jungle someplace and it's a muddy trail and your pants get muddy, well, guess what's happening the next day? So why switch pants? You just get them muddy again the next day. So it's no big deal. So you can survive a long time on just basics. I always encourage people to travel as lightly as possible, just so you have less stuff to worry about and fewer bags to be concerned about when you're in transit. And you can go a long way on a few pairs of clothes, as long as everybody's had COVID and they can't smell, then you're okay. That's one of the advantages of COVID, I guess.
Lauren asked about your life counts species wise, and I know those fluctuate as reclassification occurs, but would both of you like to mention how many birds you've seen?
Well, I'd like to say a little something about that. In South Africa, Joe and we hit milestones one day after the other. And the guy who got us those milestone birds, his name was Joe Grossell. And we actually lost Joe. He's been a guide with me for a few trips, and he got COVID in late July. And by August 14th, he was gone. So we lost him to COVID. And I kind of just wanted to mention it because of the international theme here. He was just such a special guy. So he got me my 4,000th bird on that trip in 2016. And he got Joe the day before. Joe got his 3,000th bird. It was a Klaus's cuckoo,
Right.
as I recall. Mine was a red-breasted Gonolek. And he made sure that we both got cool birds. So he was a real remarkable guy. I just wanted to mention his name tonight.
Wow.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of great stories just over the past few years from all of our club's international travelers. So I mean, it's great to hear from two of them with a lot of, advice as well as stories. So I can't wait to hear
You
more.
haven't even heard the stories, Steve.
Yeah, I know.
There are stories like really good stuff.
But it is, I mean, I'd just like to say that, as we mentioned, my first trip was in 2000, when I started going on trips with Denis and the group. And, I really got hooked on the international birding, and it's, even with, some crazy stuff that goes on, and, birding in the rain and lost luggage and stuff, it's still about my favorite thing to do. I really enjoy going on these trips. It's really something special, especially with the group that we travel with. They're all great people, and we have a lot of fun. So it's great birding and lots of fun. And it's one of the things I really enjoy.
So we're pretty lucky that we do have a group, and it's not always the same cast of characters on every trip, but if you look at all the pictures, you see there's a lot of overlap. And that, to me, is kind of what makes the trip special. Life is short, and you might as well spend it with people that you really enjoy time with. And so I've been able to, through the years, find people that I just, I'm happy to surround myself with on these trips. And we do have so much fun together. The preparation that goes into it. When we were getting together for the Thailand trip, we probably met 6 times, maybe, here at my house. I served dinner, and so there's a lot of social aspect to it. It's not just chasing down a bunch of birds. And to answer that question, we never actually quite answered that other question. So I'm if it wasn't for COVID, I would be over 5,000 birds now. So I'm about 200 birds shy of 5,000. Joe is probably similar.
Yeah,
Probably a couple
I'm
hundred.
about 3,870 or something.
So he's just shy of 4,000. So, we lost a lot of trips.
I have a feeling there'll be some new groups of birders taking trips together, hopefully forming from our club. That'll be great to hear more about that happening. Thanks to you guys promoting and educating us a bit about everything. So,
Any other questions out there?
that's all I've seen.
Okay.
I wish my international traveling is kind of behind me for the moment. I wasn't even a birder then, so I saw a few birds, but I have yet to take a real international birding trip, or even an international non-birding trip where I saw 295 species of birds. So I'm looking forward to that myself. So
I do have another question. You mentioned the guide that passed away. Do you get pretty, it sounds like when you go, you create relationships with people, guides and stuff, that then you use
Well,
these
you end up
over
with
and
some
over again.
You end up with some favorite guides. I bird a lot with Mitch Leisinger in Ecuador, and I like him so much that when I wanted to go further afield, I request him to be my guide in Colombia. I've requested him a couple times to be my guide in Brazil. He was my guide in Bolivia.
So he's
you
familiar with
do-
all of that. Wow.
Yeah, so when I asked that if he could be my guide for Brazil the first time, he had never been to Brazil. I didn't worry about that because of his skill set. He's an amazing birder. And field guides, of course, they actually sent him on as the second guide on a trip down there, at least so that he had some familiarity with some parts of Brazil. It wasn't the same itinerary that we ran, but so I have a good relationship with him. Joe was like that, Joe Grossell, and he did our first trip to South Africa in 2016, and then I liked his personality a lot, so I requested him for our trip we did to Ghana in 2018, and I actually roomed with him on that trip. And while we were rooming together and we had huge laughs. I mean, some of the Ghana's another developing country. So, I mean, there's really a lot of stuff that's just humorous there. Talk about surprises in lodging, just amazing things. But while we were together, rooming together on that trip, we actually planned yet another trip because Melissa and I were planning to go to Botswana. So he threw together an itinerary. We kind of worked something up while we were on that trip. And he said, well, as long as you're flying across the pond, he said, you should do the part of South Africa that we haven't done yet, which was Cape Town. So he actually flew to Cape Town and met us and was our guide there for like 5 days before we started the rest of the tour. So I got to know him, quite well. Real nice guy, who'd just do anything for him. He did all sorts of things for us on that first trip in 2016. People on that particular tour, we were stuck in kind of a minivan kind of a setup, and didn't even have a pop-up roof. And anybody who was a photographer on the trip, they were pretty much grumbling the whole time about that. And it wasn't Joe's fault. It was the guy who normally sets up these tours. That's how he likes to operate. And so Joe just kind of inherited that. Well, we got into Kruger, and as far as my understanding is, in Kruger, open air vehicles are verboten, but Joe somehow arranged one, and we had a very early morning safari. I think one of the reasons we left so early is so no one would see us leaving in a open sided vehicle. But he got us out there, and boy, we just knocked it out. We saw the big five within an hour and a half, something like that. We just he got us all the big game animals, and it was fantastic. This guy read tracks and everything. He was just amazing, just totally amazing person. His knowledge and the way he shared his knowledge, not just with us as clients, but with people who are coming up through the ranks, and he was trying to help them to lift themselves up. People who were less well endowed than he is. When you talk about South Africa, you can't get away from apartheid, and his take on that was that you needed to help these people, and he worked very hard because he saw these people moving into positions that they weren't unqualified for, but rather than just complain about that, he tried to help them to be qualified. He's a very unique person, really cool guy.
All right, we have one final question. Speaking of local guides, I know this is going to vary country to country, but Katie asked, what do you budget for a local guide per day? I guess it can vary pretty wildly, but
it can vary quite a bit depending on the location. And so you basically pay them what they want. And somebody earlier asked, we've been telling stories and kind of moving around. So we didn't answer a question. Somebody was asking how long. So it kind of depends on where you're going. If you're traveling halfway around the world, you're going to Southeast Asia, you're going to Africa, you might as well stay there for 3 weeks. Get your money's worth out of that flight time, because you're sitting on an airplane for 24 hours, or at least in transit for 24 hours or something by the time you count all your layovers and all that. So if you're going to do a trip like that, now if you're going down the Caribbean, you can make a jump down there and make it just a week or something like that. Go to Mexico for 5 days if you really want to. So I kind of answered that question that somebody asked about 10 minutes ago. So Joe, you got anything else to add?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. So once we can meet again, in person, and we'll all be at Ellie's, I'll be more than happy to share some stories about our international travels and some of the laughs that we've had.
Yeah, Ellen's Pub in Glen Ellen is where we had our pre-meeting dinner. So hopefully those will be starting up next year. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Informally among club members, hopefully happening at least occasionally with this group too. So, all right, well, thanks a lot, guys.